The locker room smelled of sweat and chlorine, a sharp tang that clung to the air like a second skin. I stood by my locker, towel slung over my shoulder, heart hammering. Not from the swim practice that had just ended, but from the sound of footsteps behind me. When I turned and saw Javier, my roommate, his dark eyes locked on mine with an intensity I'd never seen, the world tilted. My name's Caleb, and I'm a 24-year-old swim team captain at Emerson University, a small liberal arts college in Portland, Oregon. I'm black, wiry. With dreads I keep short to avoid hassle at meets. Javier, 25, is my roommate, a soccer player with a grin that could charm a brick wall and a backstory he guards like a vault. He's Latino, born in East LA, with a swagger that screams confidence but eyes that betray something softer, something searching. We'd been sharing a cramped dorm room for 6 months, navigating each other's quirks. His late-night salsa music, my obsession with early morning laps. I thought I knew him. I was wrong. That look in the locker room wasn't just a glance. It was a spark, a question, a confession wrapped in silence. Javier, the guy who'd spent months bragging about his high school sweetheart, Maria, was looking at me like I was the only person in the room. My breath caught, and I wondered if he could hear my pulse. "Yo, Caleb," he said, voice low. "You good?" But his eyes said something else entirely. I nodded, fumbling with my towel, trying to act normal while my mind raced. I'd known I was gay since I was 15, but I kept it quiet, especially on the team. Emerson was progressive, sure, but locker rooms have their own rules. Javier, though, he was the straightest guy I knew, or so I thought. That night, back in our dorm, he was quieter than usual, scrolling through his phone but stealing glances at me. I caught every one, my stomach twisting with a mix of hope and dread. The next morning, I woke to find Javier already gone, his bed a mess of tangled sheets. I tried to focus on my day, classes, practice, a group project in environmental science, but my thoughts kept drifting back to that look. By evening, I couldn't take it anymore. I found him at the campus coffee shop, the Beanery, tucked in a corner booth with his laptop. The place buzzed with students, the air thick with the scent of espresso and rain-damp jackets. I slid into the seat across from him, heart pounding. "Javi," I said, keeping my voice steady. "What was that yesterday? In the locker room?" He froze, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. For a moment, I thought he'd brush it off, crack a joke like he always did. But then he leaned back, exhaling sharply, and ran a hand through his dark hair. "I don't know, man," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just saw you. Really saw you." My chest tightened. I wanted to ask what that meant, but the words stuck. Instead, I said, "You've seen me 100 times. What changed?" He looked away, his jaw tight. "Everything." Over the next week, things between us shifted. Javier started lingering after practice, waiting for me by the pool, his usual banter replaced by something heavier, unspoken. I caught myself watching him too. How his laugh lit up a room, how his hands moved when he talked about his dreams of opening a community center back in LA. I'd always thought my crush on him was a dead end, a quiet ache I'd bury forever. But now I wasn't so sure. One night, after a grueling practice, we ended up at a dive bar off campus, the Rusty Anchor. The place was all dim lights and sticky tables, with a jukebox blaring old rock hits. We sat in a corner, nursing cheap beers, and the conversation turned personal. Javier told me about his family, his mom working double shifts as a nurse, his little sister dreaming of college. I shared my own story, growing up in Seattle with a single dad who never quite understood me but tried anyway. The air between us felt charged, like a storm about to break. "You ever feel like you're running from something?" Javier asked, his eyes searching mine. I swallowed hard. "Yeah, all the time." He leaned closer, his knee brushing mine under the table. "What if you stopped running?" I didn't have an answer. Not then. But when we left the bar, walking back to campus under a drizzle-soaked sky, our shoulders brushed, and neither of us pulled away. It was the closest we'd ever been, and it felt like the edge of something dangerous and beautiful. The weeks that followed were a blur of tension and possibility. Javier and I danced around whatever was growing between us, neither of us brave enough to name it. But the signs were there. The way he'd linger when we said goodnight, the way his hand grazed mine when we passed a water bottle during practice. I started noticing things I hadn't before. How he'd blush when I caught him staring, how his voice softened when he said my name. One afternoon, we ended up at a park near campus, a sprawling green space called Willow Creek. The air was crisp, the leaves a riot of red and gold. We sat on a bench by a pond, watching ducks glide across the water. I don't know what made me do it. Maybe the quiet, maybe the way the sunlight hit his face. But I turned to him and said, "Javi, what are we doing?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached for my hand, his fingers tentative but warm. My heart stopped. "I don't know," he said finally, his voice raw, "but I don't want to stop." That was the moment everything changed. We didn't kiss, not then, but we didn't need to. His hand in mine was enough. A promise, a confession, a leap into the unknown. I wanted to freeze time, to hold on to that moment forever. But life doesn't work that way. The next day, Javier got a call from his ex, Maria. She was in town, visiting her cousin, and wanted to meet up. I saw the conflict in his eyes, the way he hesitated before agreeing. "It's just coffee," he told me, but his voice lacked conviction. I nodded, pretending it didn't sting, but inside, I was unraveling. I spent that afternoon alone, swimming laps until my lungs burned, trying to drown out the fear that I was losing him before I'd even had him. When he came back to the dorm that night, his face was unreadable. "How was it?" I asked, hating how small my voice sounded. "She wants to get back together," he said, not meeting my eyes. The words hit like a punch. I wanted to ask what he wanted, but I was too afraid of the answer. Instead, I said, "What are you gonna do?" He sat on his bed, head in his hands. "I don't know, Caleb. I thought I had it all figured out. Maria, my family, the plan. But then you," he trailed off, and the silence was deafening. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying every moment, the locker room, the bar, the park. I wondered if I'd misread everything, if I'd let myself hope for something that could never be. Javier was straight, or at least he'd always thought he was. Maybe he was just confused. Maybe I was just a phase. But the next morning, he was waiting for me outside my first class, his eyes red-rimmed but determined. "I told Maria no," he said, his voice steady. "I don't know what this is, Caleb. I don't know what I am. But I know I want to figure it out with you." My heart soared, but the fear didn't vanish. This wasn't a fairy tale. We were two guys in a world that didn't always make space for us, and Javier was still grappling with who he was. But he was choosing me, at least for now, and that was enough. Over the next month, we took it slow. We didn't label anything, didn't tell anyone. It was just us, stealing moments when we could. Late-night talks in our dorm, walks through Willow Creek, quiet smiles over coffee. Every touch, every glance felt like a victory, but also a risk. I knew Javier was still wrestling with himself, with the expectations he'd grown up with, the life he'd planned. One night, during a rare snowstorm in Portland, we ended up on the roof of our dorm, bundled in coats and scarves. The campus was blanketed in white, the city lights blurred in the distance. Javier turned to me, his breath visible in the cold air. "I'm scared," he admitted. "My family, they wouldn't get this. Not yet." I nodded, my throat tight. "Mine either. But we don't have to tell them yet. We can just be." He smiled, a small, shaky thing, and leaned his head on my shoulder. For the first time, I felt like we were in this together, not just two people stumbling towards something unknown. But the world has a way of complicating things. A week later, at a swim team party, someone saw us holding hands in the backyard, hidden behind a cluster of trees. By Monday, whispers were spreading. The team captain and the soccer star, people loved a scandal. I could handle it. I'd been out to my closest friends since freshman year. But Javier, he wasn't ready. He started pulling back, skipping our usual hangouts, burying himself in soccer practice. I tried to give him space, but it hurt. I missed him, the real him, not the guarded version he showed the world. One night, I confronted him in our dorm, the tension between us thick enough to choke on. "Javi, talk to me," I said, my voice breaking. "Are you ashamed of this? Of us?" He flinched, his eyes flashing with pain. "It's not that. It's everyone else. My teammates, my family. I don't know how to do this, Caleb." "Then let me help you," I pleaded. "We can figure it out together." He looked at me, torn, and for a moment, I thought he'd walk away for good. But then he crossed the room and pulled me into a hug, his grip fierce. "I don't want to lose you," he whispered. The rumors didn't stop, and neither did the pressure. Javier's teammates started asking questions, dropping sly comments during practice. My own team was supportive, but I could see the strain on Javier's face every time we passed each other on campus. I wanted to protect him, to shield him from the judgment, but I couldn't. All I could do was be there. One evening, we went back to Willow Creek, the place where it all began. The air was warmer now, spring creeping in. We stood on the wooden bridge, the pond reflecting the last light of the day. Javier took my hand, his grip steady this time. "I'm done hiding," he said, his voice firm. "I don't know what comes next, but I'm not running anymore." I searched his eyes, looking for doubt, but all I saw was resolve. "You sure?" I asked. He nodded, a small smile breaking through. "Yeah, I'm sure." We kissed then, for the first time under the fading light. It wasn't perfect. Our noses bumped and we laughed halfway through. But it was ours. It was real. Months later, we were still figuring things out. Javier told his sister first, then his mom. It wasn't easy. There were tears, questions, long silences, but they didn't turn him away. My dad took longer to come around, but he did in his own quiet way. The world didn't change overnight, but it didn't need to. We had each other. One afternoon, we went back to Willow Creek, the place that held so many of our moments. We sat on the same bench, watching the ducks, the water, the world moving on around us. Javier leaned against me, his hand in mine. "You know," he said, "I never thought I'd end up here, but I'm glad I did." I smiled, my heart full. Me too. Life wasn't perfect. There were still whispers, still challenges. But we weren't running anymore. We were building something together, and that was enough.